Yo, what's up, guys? It's your boy Dyno here. So when people say MapleStory Classic is finally here, I keep catching myself reacting the same way every time. Yeah, sort of. We're close, but we're not close enough to stop asking questions. And the questions I care about right now are what's happening in the background. They're about the systems that decide how the game actually feels long before any of that matters. When I think back to old school Maple, there are a lot of mechanics that technically existed but never really influenced how I played. Defense is probably the clearest example of that. I never built around weapon defense, I never thought about mitigation. If I could survive a hit, everything else was completely undone with potions. HP became the only defensive stat that mattered, and once you realized that, the rest kind of faded. And that wasn't just a warrior thing. When I played Mage, Magic Guard completely changed how survivability worked.
You shall not pass!
MP stopped feeling like a resource and started feeling like a second HP bar. As long as I had enough HP to cover the small percentage of damage that leaked through, defense just wasn't part of the conversation. Once Hyperbody became standard in party play, especially later on in bossing, that mindset spread to almost every job. Survivability boiled down to the same idea: don't get one shot and drink through everything else. That design worked back then. I'm not saying it didn't, but it also meant defense never really had a chance to matter in a meaningful way. And that's why I keep coming back to this question with MapleStory Classic. What do they actually do with it? Because if defense mattered even a little, not enough to make damage irrelevant, but enough to influence decisions, because it could quietly change how the entire game is played. Suddenly scrolling for defense wouldn't feel like a waste. Defensive gear might let me attempt content earlier than I normally would, or grind in places that used to feel completely off limits. Those kind of changes don't show up as flashy bullet points and patch notes, but they completely reshape how progression feels when you're actually playing. So before we continue, it's time for this week's Who's That Maplemon?
Who's that Maplemon?
It's Mixed Golem.
The same thought process applies to skills. We already know some low utility skills were removed or replaced, and honestly, I'm fine with that. What I care about more is whether those changes actually solve the original problems, or if they just move them around. Final Attack is a good example. I don't think making it an active button is a bad idea. If anything, it makes the job more engaging instead of just holding the spacebar. But if the damage formula behind it hasn't changed, then the skill still carries the same issue it always did. It just looks different now. To me, that's the difference between a meaningful change and a cosmetic one. Where things really start to get interesting though, is skill interaction. A lot of depth in old school Maple didn't come from individual skills. It came from how they worked together, or sometimes didn't. I keep thinking about things like Threaten and Disorder. If both reduce weapon defense by 20%, do they stack? Do they override each other? Or do they conflict in ways that aren't obvious unless you test them? How about Fighter's Rage and Bandit Steel for weapon attack? Do they stack, or will Steel override the rage timer? Clearer tooltips are another thing I'm paying close attention to. Even something as basic as healing still raises questions for me. Does heal actually scale with party size now, and by how much for each party member? And then there's Cold Beam. Is it meant to freeze targets, slow them, or sit somewhere in between? Clear explanations would go a long way here. I understand back then we had translation issues, but it's 2026, guys. These sound like small details, but they're the kind of things that define party roles, cooperation, and how much depth actually exists beyond surface level builds. Stats are another area where my experience with old school Maple really shapes how I'm looking at Classic. Once Maple weapons became common, ignoring secondary stats became the optimal way to play. The statless meta simplified everything. You didn't really experiment, you just followed what worked. If MapleStory Classic wants to avoid repeating that path, stat scaling needs to influence real decisions again. Knowing what each point in strength, dex, int, or luck actually contributes to each class helps determine whether the secondary stats actually shape builds, or if we're headed back towards the same one-dimensional choices. That same curiosity carries over into monsters and progression. So far we only know about one confirmed monster EXP change, and honestly that just raises more questions for me. Which monsters were adjusted? Were old forgotten maps made viable again? Did loot tables change alongside EXP values? Because in old school Maple, choosing a grind map was never just about the experience, loot mattered just as much. If MapleStory Classic adjusts EXP without touching loot tables, some maps are still gonna feel dead. I remember spending hours grinding for steelies or ELBs before I was like, screw it, I'll just buy them from the free market, because I never saw them. Don't get me wrong, valuable loot should definitely still be rare, but my main concern is aside from the new maps, we already know what monster drops what loot, and because of that, we lose a sense of discovery within the game. And while we're on the topic of loot, there's one more system I keep thinking about. Party loot. In old school Maple, there was an unspoken respect around loot. If you got the kill, it was understood that the drop was yours. And if you didn't need it, but someone else did in your party, you'd usually pass it along. That kind of trust feels rare in modern MMO culture, where everything tends to feel quietly competitive. We've already seen a brief look at party loot settings, but I'm curious what other options exist, and how those systems fit into MapleStory Classic without losing that sense of shared respect. When I look at MapleStory Classic right now, what matters most to me isn't nostalgia or big announcements, it's how these underlying systems are handled. These are the details that decide how the game actually plays long before endgame ever comes into the picture. Old school Maple had a lot of mechanics that existed without really influencing decisions at all. Classic has a chance to become more intentional, to make defense, skill, stats, progression, and even loot distribution actually matter, instead of just sitting quietly in the background. We're still early and there's a lot we still don't know, but the choices being made now are the ones that still decide whether Classic feels thoughtful or just familiar. If you've been paying attention to these systems too, I'd love to hear what stands out to you the most. And if you want more breakdowns like this as Classic develops, feel free to like the video and subscribe. I'll see you guys later.